Very good evening to all the viewers and all the attendees of this video conference. I'm delighted to be here to share my thoughts. I hope all of you are taking good care of your health and are keeping safe. I will speak briefly about the economy. Undoubtedly, we are going through difficult times. The current economic situation is because of the pandemic. But what is also important for us to understand is, what are the key things that we need to be focusing on, once the economy recovers after the pandemic is actually brought under control. So a couple of things I want to mention. As you would all know, that the economy, Indian economy, went into this crisis with slower growth, and especially the banking sector facing difficulties. The slower growth itself was because of some reasons which I'll actually briefly talk about, and thereby focus on what should be the key areas that we must concentrate on to get back the economy on the growth path. I will mention that I think it's very important for us to remember that the true revival of the economy critically depends on the pandemic itself, because in times like these, everybody indulges in what is called the precautionary motive to save. It is related to the uncertainty stemming from the pandemic. If you look at in the Indian context, the PMJDY balances, Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana balances in these accounts. These are 40 crore accounts at the bottom of the pyramid. Typically, people at the bottom of the pyramid, tend to consume almost every rupee of what they actually earn. So their propensity to save is typically very low. But during this time, ever since the lockdown has started, and of course we've eased the lockdown now, but since March, the balances in these accounts have increased in excess of about 20,000 crores on average. That's 500 rupees per account, and that's an important point to keep in mind, which is that that people are basically saving in order to be able to take care of possible expenditures that might be required on the health front. This is not just in India; it's happening in the United States as well. The checks that were mailed by the U.S. Treasury in the month of March, to all the citizens, those checks actually have been used primarily for consuming essential items, especially food. Unlike in India, the United States doesn't have a public distribution system, and there has been no impact on expenditure in durable items or discretionary items. So this is one key aspect that we all have to keep in mind. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, the impact on discretionary spending, like tourism, movies, restaurants, all these have gotten affected. Of course, the online economy, actually the gig economy, is doing better, especially in India because of the digitization of the economy. But overall discretionary spending is lower. I think all of you from your own personal experiences also will be able to share that that has been the case. For instance, I can say that we've not gone out over the last 6-7 months, even to no movie or a or to eat out either. Even when we've been ordering, we've been very cautious. Or ordering food from out, actually have been very, very cautious. So that sort of exemplifies the fact that all households are in sort of spending primarily on essential items. So, and that the demand impact of that affects affects consumption. The question that many of you would have in mind, therefore, is why shouldn't why shouldn't there be a fiscal push? I think the point here to remember is, I have 2 points to make, and then I'll come to some of the broader points. One is that when you look at the package that has been given, the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, a lot of which was focused on liquidity and credit. Liquidity and credit eventually does affect consumption in the economy. So, it is not as if you only need the fiscal spend to boost consumption. So, through MSMEs and through wages that are paid to MSMEs, it has impacted consumption, has basically reduced the impact on the consumption that would have happened but for this spending. In other words, what I'm saying is that if you take the GDP identity C plus I plus G plus X minus M, which is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, the government spending is only one part of it, and in India, it's about 10 to 12%. So it's the consumption and the investment that decreases in times like these, and the liquidity and credit measures that have been taken actually have helped to sort of reduce the impact of consumption and investment. Especially, for instance, the Atmanirbhar Bharat package had the 3 lakh crore credit to MSMEs, which actually would go into investment and consumption. Right, more consumption, less investment. The important reason actually why I mentioned about the precautionary motive to save is that if, for instance, till the time the uncertainty about the pandemic remains, just giving cash in the hands of people or even giving tax breaks will only go and sit as savings in the hands, in the accounts of people, and will not have an impact on consumption because of the uncertainty. And this is where distinguishing this particular crisis to to other economic crises, be it the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, or any other, the Latin American crises, etc., is different, because all those crises were economic in nature, and therefore even the uncertainty, the government could basically enact policies to take care of the uncertainty. But this particular crisis is a health crisis, and so the investment in vaccine is a good thing, but till the vaccine does not come about and the pandemic is not brought in control, governments from the economic side can do very little to actually avoid the uncertainty part. And it's the uncertainty that affects the motive to save, and thereby the impact on durable consumption. I think it's very important to remember this point when you think about the fiscal spend. So broadly, what I would say, therefore, is we are waiting for the right time to actually do the fiscal spend. Once the uncertainty is brought under control, all accounts actually seem to suggest that vaccine, should be accessible to a lot of people in the next 5 to 6 months, which should bring down uncertainty. That will be the right point to actually give the demand impetus through a fiscal spend. So that's sort of my broad assessment of the current situation and what we basically need to, what is the policy response. But what I want to do is to give you a broader sense of the economy, and what are the three key things which I reckon are really critical for economic growth going forward. Kavya was mentioning about some of the reform measures. I think that's something which is singularly outstanding in the Indian context, because no other country has announced reform measures as part of its COVID package. India has been the exception in announcing those reform measures. And the reform measures, especially on the agriculture side, I think are quite critical. Similarly, the policy on privatization, which followed from some of, both of all these followed from the analysis that we had done in the economic survey, those will actually bring in substantial dividends once the economy is back to normalcy. But what I want to now do is to actually share with you some, let me just, some slides on what I think has been happening in the last few years. So this is, I hope people are able to see the presentation. What this slide shows is the government expenditure in red, or the government spending in red, and the private sector, what economists call the net balance. So government net balance, which includes the public sector, units as well, PSUs as well. That's in the red line, and the yellow dotted one is the private sector net balance. What you will notice up till 2011, and the period after 2011, I'll talk about a little later, but up until 2011 is the very strong negative correlation. So in other words, and the way to read this is that If you look at the period, around 97, 98, when the Asian financial crisis happened, the private sector's, fortunes were dipping. And that's when the government enhanced its spending substantially, built infrastructure, especially the Golden Quadrilateral, for instance, stands out among its infrastructure spending. Even the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan was launched at that point in time. And that for that, obviously, the government had to increase its spending. So when the government increased its spending, the private sector's basically fortunes improved. And that's what is basically counter-cyclical fiscal policy that was followed in the Asian financial crisis period. That happened under NDA 1. The second, second crisis was basically the global financial crisis, when under UPA 2, again the private sector's fortune started dipping. The government, increased its spend, but there was an important difference. The quality of spending during this period was not very good. It was primarily revenue spending, and as a result, while the private sector's, fortunes increased for a short while, it did not sustain, because the spending, both on the banking sector side and in terms of the fiscal spend as well, was not very good. So it was a very ephemeral, increase that happened in the fortunes of the private sector. And then, of course, we know now what happened. Actually, 2013, India suffered the taper tantrum. In contrast, in the time of the Asian financial crisis, the quality of spending was excellent. As a result, after having growth of about 3.84%, so India had that period of about 4 years of about 4% growth. During that period, India picked up its growth to clock about 8.5% on average in the next few years. In fact, UPA 1 enjoyed the lagged effect of this fiscal spend. So the first, in the entire almost four years of the UPA 1 was actually the lagged effect of that spend. And this is something that we all have to remember. In an economy, the impact of fiscal spending typically manifests with a lag. In contrast, so this is what happened in the last two crises. But if we look at the period after 2011, what you will notice is, and let me see if I can, yes, after 2011, this negative correlation has actually become, has just gone out. So the counter-cyclical spending, this is which should be a biblical aspect of macroeconomic policy, has not happened. That's one of the key reasons why the economy, actually the growth in the economy, slowed down significantly. You may ask me why this is the case. I'll come back to that in a minute. But let me show you, and this is the red arrow shows this absence of the negative correlation. In fact, if you see, the correlation statistically was about minus 0.7 till 2011, while it is 0.1 after 2011. And this is one of the key things that which has really affected the macroeconomic fortunes. I'll contrast this with what has happened in the advanced economies, where counter-cyclical fiscal policy, is followed in a biblical manner. So take a look for the United States. This is for the US. Since the 1980s, even if you go, a longer period, you will again see very, strong negative correlation. So as soon as the private sector's fortunes start going down, the government steps up its spending. That's the counter-cyclicality. And this is basically what John Maynard Keynes had advocated. So you see the correlation here to be minus 0.9 between the government's net balances and the private sector net balances. In particular, if you see that the financial crisis period, global financial crisis, the fortunes of the private sector started dipping, the government stepped up its spending, and that actually enabled the private sector to come back. Same phenomenon you see in the case of United Kingdom as well. Here too, the correlation is minus 0.9. And the same phenomenon with the global financial crisis, you see there. Now, one of the reasons why India has not done, if you see, let me go back to this chart that I was showing for India since 2011. So during the latter half of UPA2, we had basically policy paralysis, and so we did not end up actually doing much. But even in this period here, our extensive focus on fiscal deficit, on keeping the fiscal deficit under a lid, has led to basically the decrease in the fiscal spend. Now remember, this is also a period where the banking sector has been cleaned up, the NPAs have been cleaned up. Typically, when the banking sector is cleaned up, private sector surpluses go down, and so it's a time where counter-cyclical fiscal policy should be even more pronounced, and yet that has not happened. It has basically made it a double whammy, which also became a triple whammy because some of the monetary policy, the much tighter monetary policy, right, instead of monetary policy that should have been actually far more accommodative. So it's in some sense a triple whammy that has affected the macroeconomy, which is what has led to the slowdown in growth. The primary reason I'll tell you why we've had is because of a lack of clear understanding of the direction of causality between between growth and fiscal sustainability. For a country like India, with very high growth rates, it is actually growth that leads to fiscal sustainability, not the other way around. And because of the paucity of time, I'm not getting into that. But it is we find, my office has done some very careful analysis to show that it's the direction of causality runs from growth to fiscal sustainability. In other words, when you get growth, the debt sustainability also happens. But instead, if you put the cart before the horse and you just focus on debt sustainability and fiscal deficits, you get neither growth nor do you get fiscal sustainability. So that is something which is that clarity of thought in terms of how to on macroeconomic policy has basically led to muddled thinking, and thereby has affected the macroeconomic fortunes. So this is one key aspect of why we basically went into the crisis with lower growth. A second key aspect that I want to show is the banking sector. There's also something, all this is analysis that has been covered in the in the surveys. So what happened as a result of the bad loans and the NPAs in the banking sector, as a result of it, there was a lot of willful default and hanky panky in the banks, which basically led to some investigation, which has then increased risk aversion among banks, and has brought down corporate lending. So that was the first step. The decline in corporate lending then affected investment. The decline in investment affected economic growth. That was the second step. The decline in growth then has had an impact on consumption. The decline in consumption then has had an impact on investment. So it's basically started with the banking sector, but then as a result, this virtuous cycle that runs from investment to growth to consumption and thereby investment, that has slowed down. Remember, it's not running the other way around; it just slowed down. The cycle has slowed down, and that is why growth actually has declined. But I want to point out actually a bigger aspect that we must think about in the context of the banking sector, which is that the Indian banking sector is extremely small. It's a dwarf compared to the size of the economy. So if we really have to speed up growth in the Indian economy, we basically need to be focusing on the banking sector. As a policy maker, if you ask me the top, what is the biggest worry for me, it is the banking sector. And why? Take a look here. This chart shows the number of banks in the global top 100, for all the economies. Notice that China today has 18 banks in the global top 100. India has only one, even though India is the fifth largest economy in the world. If the Indian banking sector was commensurate to the size of its economy, today we should have had 6 banks in the global top 100. And by the way, even the one bank we have is basically ranked 55th in the world. So the banking sector is really small compared to the size of the economy. Even economies like Singapore, Sweden, which are 1/6 and 1/8 the size of the Indian economy, have about 3 or 4 banks in the global top 100. So, by far the Indian banking sector is extremely small, and credit is really critical for growth because of the credit multiplier. So this is, has been holding back growth. Even when we actually try to push credit, the quality of lending has not been very good. So as a result, we have this accelerator brake phenomenon, when we try to accelerate credit, we basically generate NPAs, and then brakes have to be, have to be clammed on it. So that's the way the banking, so both the quantity in terms of the scale and the quality of its lending has been really, really something that needs to be picked up in the Indian banking sector. I'm going to show you in a couple of other slides the same problem, which is, if you look in terms of the, this, some of us may wonder, is it because we are a very large population? Well, the point there actually is that it's not just because of the population. So if you look at, for instance, China is as populous as us, but China is a positive outlier, while India is a negative outlier in terms of the domestic credit to the private sector. In fact, among OECD economies, India is by far the lowest in terms of the penetration of credit. And this is something that is actually, all of you as investors must think about. The Indian banking sector needs substantial investment and, lot more banks, lot more competition for it to be growing to the size of the economy. Similarly, if you look at it in terms of the, so even if, let me just see if you're, yes. Yes, just a couple of more minutes. Even if we look at it in terms of the GDP per capita, here as well, India is a negative outlier. So the solution to this is primarily, in the Indian banks have to use fintech to be able to really, to sort of leapfrog in terms of the quality and the scale of the banking sector. The last problem that I want to actually, and just let me last part that I want to focus on is exports. If you look at economies like Japan, China, Thailand, South Korea, Vietnam, these countries that have grown over the last 50 to 60 years, they've grown on the back of exports. And here's where India lags as well. And that is primarily because we've just not specialized enough in exports. If you look at the first chart here, which shows the export market penetration for India and China, clearly China has done very well. Now, if you split that up into the impact of specialization, which is picking specific sectors and and focusing your energies, the country's energies on that sector, that's where we basically have lost out. The entire, almost 75% of the export performance, or a lack of it, is because of lack of specialization. When it comes to diversification, we do very well. So the economic survey focused on, we need to be focusing on assembly and assemble for India on labor intensive sectors. So to summarize, basically, fiscal policy, we need to be making it far more counter cyclical. Number one, banking sector needs to really grow, and that's where actually huge investments are required. And third, exports, we need to have a much more focused strategy. The PLI scheme that actually now the government is coming up with is actually manifesting the specialization, but we need far more emphasis on this. Overall, as a country, just as investors do and companies do, we need to be focused, actually, prioritize these three areas: get fiscal policy to be counter-cyclical, expand the banking sector significantly, and get exports to actually be focused on specialized specialized sectors, especially labor-intensive sectors. And that's what we are focusing on right now to actually get growth back. Thanks. I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Subbu. That was very, very interesting. You are really quite articulate. You have the ability to put very complex economic ideas in layman's terms. I have a few questions which are following from your this thing. They're based on what our participants are sending me. So one is, you mentioned there's a correlation. You said that the causality is driven by growth. When the linkage between fiscal sustainability is driven by growth. So are we to assume that given our fiscal situation today, there's no room for another stimulus?
So I think
because we're not growing. Yeah.
No, Prem, let me clarify. From your question, I actually get the concern that maybe what I said was not very clear. What I'm saying is that, for the Indian economy, because we are a very high growth economy, and conceptually what happens, when you grow at high rates, and debt sustainability is about the debt to GDP ratio.
Correct.
When you grow higher, the denominator increases much faster. And so growth is what brings debt sustainability, not the other way around. And so the mistake that we've been often making is to say, let's focus on debt sustainability, and thereby, not doing enough counter-cyclical fiscal spending. In contrast, what we should be doing, and even in times like this, is to say that it's okay for the debt to GDP ratio to go up, because we need to just spend right now, Keynesian focus on government spending, because in times like these, private sector generally is risk averse and will not spend enough. So for instance, the government is working on the infrastructure pipeline. That's about the implementation. So do the spending so that private sector surpluses increase, because when government spend, basically private sectors then get contracts and they're able to improve their fortune. So what I'm saying is 2 points. One, focus on growth. So in this tension between debt sustainability and growth, whenever push comes to shove, focus on growth. That's the first thing. So in other words, even if it requires you to, the government to increase its fiscal deficit, increase debt to GDP, that is fine. Because once we get growth back in a couple of years, debt will become sustainable as well. So that point number one. Point number two, even though our debt to GDP ratio may be increasing this year, that's fine. Extraordinary times like these require extraordinary measures, and therefore we must be actually focusing on getting growth back by increasing government spending. The last point I'll say, actually, which is related to my preliminary remarks, that it's important for the nature of fiscal spending. Fiscal spending has to be focused more on getting employment back, because it is employment that will actually generate, will give the people the assurance that they actually can go and spend. So that is, it's not good enough to actually just put cash in the hands of people. It has to be where people have that assurance, and so I focus on employment is very critical. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. My next question is, you've underlined the need for additional investments in the banking sector. You clearly feel that it needs to expand the existing players. Hugely. So probably the existing players need to expand, and perhaps room for new players. But on the other hand, the banking regulator has been very, very conservative in issuing out new licenses. The norms for issuing new licenses, branch expansion, and these things remain fairly stringent. So, what is your advice to them? Because clearly, I know for a fact that at least the last time there was a talk of expanding banking and allowing many more this thing. There were many big houses which were kind of prevented. I'm not saying getting into the right or wrong of it, but the point is the policy prevented a lot of players from entering the field. That's all.
See, conceptually, I have made it very clear that the Indian banking sector is quite small, compared to the size of its economy.
Absolutely.
As a result, we do not have adequate competition.
Yeah.
Even those private sector banks that invest in technology, even those have not invested in technology on corporate lending. For instance, those banks that actually are technologically forward have tried to have invested in retail lending, not as much on corporate lending. What we need to figure out is to be able to give those few 1,000 crore loans in such a way that the loans come back and do not create NPAs. And that's something, so both private sector and public sector banks need to be using far more technology analytics. I'll remind my viewers about, so when I did my BTech thesis at IIT Kanpur, my thesis there was in the application of neural networks to electrical engineering problems. Neural networks were the antecedent to artificial intelligence, machine learning. So in other words, about 25 years back, these things were being done. But yet, in the Indian banking sector today, does not use even some of the rudimentary analytics that they must be doing. And I'll emphasize this point by mentioning, see, the AI, developed software for chess, Deep Thought, ended up defeating Gary Kasparov, who is by far the highest ELO rated player ever. And importantly, this software was not even, told the rules of chess. It was only fed the games. It learned the rules of chess by reading the game using AI and developed tactics and strategy to be able to defeat chess. The kind of things that happen in but willful default is far less complicated compared to what you require in chess. The point being that if AI can defeat the highest rated elo rated player, it can easily defeat willful default. In other words, our banks, especially private sector banks, need to be investing in technology, AI, machine learning to do corporate lending. Those that have actually been able to avoid NPAs have done that by staying away from corporate lending. But that's not how you actually get growth in the economy, because investment is a critical driver of growth. Now, your point about actually the regulator, as I said, conceptually, I've made clear what needs to be done. Implementation of that is basically in the regulator's ballpark.
Great. Thank you, Subbu. We are actually very grateful that you have with us. I know these are very challenging times for everyone, including the government of India, and I'm sure all of you are burning the midnight oil to make the economy recover faster and set it on a faster growth trajectory. Thank you for being with us and sharing your thoughts with us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Prem, for inviting me.